The sky was the kind of soft summer blue that painters dream of. Clear, open, stretching wide above the Holden family's backyard in suburban Virginia. A breeze rustled through the trimmed hedges as the scent of grilled ribs mingled with blooming hydrangeas. Folding chairs lined the lawn. String lights glowed faintly in preparation for dusk. Margaret Holden, 62, wore her favorite pale blue apron over a crisp white blouse. Her silver-gray hair was swept into a low chignon, her green eyes catching the sun every time she moved between the grill and the picnic table. Hosting barbecues had become her language of love, a tradition that symbolized family unity, no matter how chaotic life could get. Her husband, Thomas Holden, 64, stood by the smoker in his usual cargo shorts and khaki polo. He had always been the charm of the couple, handy with a joke, quick to offer someone a drink, and beloved by guests for his easy presence. Ryan, their 38-year-old son, had helped set up the tables with his wife Kayla, 35, earlier that morning. Kayla had brought along a bright yellow fruit salad and a speaker playing soft jazz. The couple had recently moved into the neighborhood just a few blocks away. Everyone said Ryan had inherited Margaret's steadiness and Thomas's charisma, a rare blend. But amid the laughter and sizzling burgers, Margaret noticed something that didn't sit right. It was subtle, the kind of thing only a woman with decades of quiet observation could notice. Denise, Kayla's aunt, had arrived fashionably late, stepping out of her shiny white SUV in a flowing floral dress that hugged a little tighter than necessary. She was 56, recently divorced, and carried herself with a theatrical air. As Margaret approached to welcome her, she caught Thomas looking in Denise's direction, not in a casual, familiar way, but with a spark Margaret hadn't seen in years. It passed quickly, hidden behind his usual pleasantries. But it was there. Later, as drinks flowed and the smell of grilled corn filled the air, Margaret watched Denise and Thomas again. They stood near the garden arbor, laughing, then leaning close. Denise reached up and adjusted Thomas's collar, her fingers brushing the back of his neck with deliberate softness. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Too long for just small talk. Margaret blinked, then looked away. She served another plate of potato salad and smiled at her granddaughter, twirling barefoot on the grass. Maybe she was overthinking. It was a party. People laughed, mingled, shared jokes. That didn't mean anything, did it? But an hour later, as Margaret was returning from the kitchen with extra napkins, she paused at the window. There, behind the drinks table, Thomas slipped a small white envelope into Denise's hand. She accepted it quickly, eyes darting around like someone with something to hide. Then she tucked it into her purse without a word. Margaret stood frozen. Was it money? A note? Tickets? She shook the thought away and walked back outside, her smile locked in place. The evening carried on. Children ran around with chocolate on their faces. Kayla clinked her glass to announce dessert. Guests complimented the food. Thomas made a toast about family being everything. But in Margaret's mind, the toast rang hollow. She didn't say a word, not yet. She knew herself too well to speak on suspicion alone. But something had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. In the middle of their perfect backyard, under fairy lights and grilled ribs, Margaret felt a coldness settle inside her bones. A woman knows when something is wrong, and this time it wasn't going away. The morning after the BBQ, Margaret stood in front of the kitchen sink, slowly rinsing dishes while the late sunlight spilled over her garden. The scent of charcoal still lingered faintly in the backyard, and remnants of laughter played in her head like an old tape. She tried to shake it off, chalk it up to imagination, fatigue, maybe even a flare of jealousy. But the image of that envelope being handed off, it sat like a stone in her chest. Thomas walked in behind her, kissing the top of her head lightly, as he always did. "I'll be out for a bit. Gotta run to the hardware store," he said, grabbing his keys. Margaret turned, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Didn't you go last week? You needed new paintbrushes, right?" Thomas blinked. Yeah. I forgot a few things." He smiled. It looked normal, casual, rehearsed. She nodded and let him go. That was the beginning of the pattern. By the end of that week, he'd made 2 more unplanned trips. Once to help a neighbor with the deck, and another to return something at the mall. Always vague, always confident she wouldn't question it. But Margaret was paying attention now. On Thursday, she tried to pick up his phone from the nightstand to move it while cleaning. It lit up with a new passcode screen. He'd never locked it before. That night, while Thomas dozed off during the 10 o'clock news, Margaret opened her laptop and quietly reviewed the shared credit card statements. The newest entry stood out sharply. Charges from a boutique flower shop, a fancy bistro she'd never heard of, and a spa day package, purchased just 2 days after the BBQ. The last one stung. She couldn't remember the last time he'd treated her to a day off like that. Her breathing turned shallow, but she closed the laptop gently and went upstairs. Friday afternoon. She invited her friend Nancy over for coffee. Nancy had known Margaret since college, sharp, intuitive, and loyal. The kind of friend who didn't sugarcoat things. After some small talk, Margaret leaned in, hands clasped around her cup. "Tell me if I'm being crazy," she said quietly. "I think Thomas is involved with Denise." Nancy raised a brow. "Involved? How?" Margaret hesitated. "I saw something at the BBQ, and the way he looked at her, touched her. He gave her an envelope behind the drinks table, and now he's different." Nancy's eyes narrowed. "You're not crazy." Margaret exhaled, relieved. "You've been married for 4 decades, Nancy continued. "You know his rhythms. If something's off, it's off. Don't confront him yet. Don't accuse. Watch, collect, be smart." Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's what I was thinking. I just needed someone to say it." Over the weekend, Margaret started taking quiet mental notes. She observed his mood shifts, the way his eyes lingered too long on his phone, the missing cologne bottle from his drawer. She didn't cry, not yet. There was still room for doubt, and Margaret had learned long ago that tears were precious, meant for truth, not suspicion. On Sunday, Thomas came home, smelling faintly of rose-scented lotion. He said he'd been at the gym. Margaret said nothing. Later that night, while folding laundry, she found a small receipt tucked into his pant pocket. A single cocktail, charged to a downtown hotel bar. He hadn't mentioned any hotel. By Monday, Margaret had stopped pretending. The pieces didn't need more time to fall together. They had already done so. All that remained was proof and a plan. She stood in her living room that evening, looking at the photographs on the wall. Their wedding portrait, Ryan's high school graduation, their first trip to the Grand Canyon. A life carefully built, frame by frame. She wasn't about to let it be torn apart in whispers and shadows. If Thomas and Denise wanted to play secret games, they had underestimated the quiet strength of a woman who'd held her family together for over 40 years. Margaret wasn't going to confront. She was going to expose. The next morning, Margaret poured herself a cup of black coffee and sat at the edge of her bed, letting the steam warm her face while her thoughts ran cold. She couldn't stop replaying the way Denise had tossed her hair that day, how she leaned into Thomas's space as if they had some private understanding. It was all so familiar now in hindsight. So many things she hadn't wanted to believe were meaningful. Like that moment 3 weeks ago at Ryan and Kayla's anniversary dinner. They had all been gathered around the long oak dining table, laughter rising with the clinking of glasses. Margaret had been carving the roast when Denise, in that teasing voice of hers, said, "Some men age like wine, especially in this family." Everyone chuckled politely, but Margaret remembered catching Denise's glance sliding sideways toward Thomas, who smirked back behind his glass of Merlot. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone else to notice, but not for a wife. There were other flashes now, things Margaret had dismissed. Like the morning, Denise stopped by unannounced, saying she'd lost an earring in Margaret's backyard after the last BBQ. Thomas had offered to help her look, and the two of them disappeared behind the shed for over 15 minutes. Margaret had assumed they were chatting, neighbors, after all. Now she saw it differently. And then there was the Sunday evening when Thomas insisted on driving Denise to her apartment to check on a burst pipe. He had said it so casually, adding, "She's not great with tools." Margaret had smiled and nodded. Now she could slap herself for being so trusting. But she wasn't just grieving the betrayal. She was grieving the erosion of her instincts, those little betrayals of self where she told herself she was overthinking, too suspicious, too old-fashioned to understand modern friendships. Well, now she understood just fine. That evening, she sat at her desk and opened a file folder labeled Household. She pulled out the last 3 months' worth of shared credit card statements. Underlined in red were the following: June 3rd, Le Papillon Spa, $147. June 12th, The Gilded Fox, Bistro, $89.50. June 21st, Floral Dreams, Boutique, $64.99. July 2nd, Midtown Regency Hotel Bar, $36. She had never been to any of these places, but she remembered that on June 3rd she had been home recovering from a migraine. Thomas had said he was out picking up mulch from the garden center. The dates stung. The amounts didn't matter. The lies did. Margaret considered confronting Thomas that night. She almost did. But then she thought of Ryan, her son, who adored his father, her daughter-in-law, who thought of Thomas as a second dad, and worst of all, Kayla, who had no idea that her aunt might be sleeping with her father-in-law. The fallout would be volcanic, but worse than that, it would break the fragile bond holding her family together. So, Margaret decided something in that moment. She wouldn't just confront. She wouldn't accuse. She would expose, with care but with certainty. Not just for herself, but for the truth. Later that night, when Thomas was asleep, Margaret sat at the edge of their bed, watching him breathe. His features looked peaceful in sleep, softened by years of shared memories, parenting, holidays, sickness, and support. How strange, she thought, how someone you've known your whole life can suddenly become foreign. She didn't feel rage, not yet, just grief. Grief that the man who once promised her forever had traded honesty for secrecy, dignity for desire. She rose silently, turned off the lamp, and walked down to the guest room. And for the first time in 43 years of marriage, Margaret didn't sleep beside her husband. She slept alone, and it felt strangely right. Margaret wasn't impulsive by nature. She believed in steadiness, in waiting for the right moment to act. So the next morning, as Thomas cheerfully stirred cream into his coffee and chatted about trimming the hedges, Margaret nodded along, masking the storm building beneath her calm expression. By noon, he was off again, helping Ryan move some boxes into storage, he claimed. Margaret simply smiled and handed him his water bottle. As soon as the door clicked shut, she went to work. She walked to the garage, pulled down the ladder, and opened the small storage bin above the rafters. Inside was an old security camera kit Thomas had bought years ago during a burglary scare in the neighborhood. He never installed it. Said it was too much work for something that would never happen to them. Well, now something had happened. That afternoon, Margaret set up one discreet camera under the patio eaves, just above the backyard seating area, where guests usually gathered during BBQs. The lens was small, hidden among the vines. The setup was simple and quietly effective. She tested it from her laptop and confirmed it was working. Next, she invited Denise to lunch at her house later that week, making it sound casual. "Just us girls," Margaret said over the phone. "I want your help planning something for Ryan's birthday next month. You've got such flair." Denise sounded pleased. "Of course, honey. I love that idea. I've got this fabulous new sangria recipe we can try." Thomas, overhearing the conversation, peeked into the room later and offered to help too. Margaret, ever gracious, replied, "Oh, yes, dear. Why not? Denise always loves your company." She watched carefully as Thomas nodded, too quickly, too smoothly. The trap was set. On Thursday, the three of them sat outside in the yard beneath the hummingbird feeder. Margaret had set out cucumber sandwiches, lemonade, and a small notepad full of fake ideas for a birthday surprise. She played the part of the cheerful planner perfectly, laughing, sipping, complimenting Denise's scarf. "I need to grab the extra gift catalog I printed," Margaret said, rising slowly. "Be back in just a sec." She left them alone, and the camera watched. Inside the kitchen, Margaret didn't move. She stood beside the counter, eyes on her laptop screen, breath caught in her throat. There they were, her husband and Denise, alone for less than 30 seconds before Denise leaned over and touched Thomas's wrist, her voice low but audible through the mic feed. "You're still planning to tell her, right?" Denise said. Thomas chuckled softly. "Of course, just not yet. Timing's everything." Denise pursed her lips. "It's been months, Tommy." "I know," he said, his hand now gently grazing her knee. "But you know how she is. Calm on the outside, but underneath, she's steel." Margaret's jaw clenched. Steel. He was right. And he just handed her the final nail in the coffin. When she returned outside moments later, neither of them noticed the subtle shift in her eyes. She smiled as she sat, offered them both more lemonade, and suggested they include a karaoke machine at Ryan's party. It was almost laughable how easily people gave themselves away when they thought no one was watching. After Denise left, Thomas lingered by the window. "You two seem to get along today." Margaret smiled. "Yes, we did. She's got quite the personality." He nodded, almost relieved. Later that night, Margaret saved the footage onto a USB drive and locked it in her jewelry box. Then she gathered the printed credit card statements, stacked them neatly, and tucked them beside it. The evidence was no longer a question. It was a fact. Now, she just had to choose the right time. And when she thought about it, the idea came so clearly, it felt like fate. Another backyard BBQ. A party, just like the one where it began. But this time, the celebration wouldn't end in laughter. It would end in truth. The invitation was simple, friendly, and impossible to refuse. Celebrating Kayla's promotion backyard BBQ at the Holdens this Saturday. Margaret sent it out through the family group chat, making sure to include everyone. Ryan, Kayla, Kayla's parents, a few close cousins, and of course, Denise. She watched for the read receipts to roll in. One by one, they did. Denise responded with a party hat emoji. Thomas said, "I'll help with the grill, same as always." Perfect. Margaret spent the next few days preparing every detail of the event as if it were just another joyful gathering, because that's what everyone expected of her. She arranged for fairy lights to be strung along the fences, brought in fresh patio cushions, and even baked Kayla's favorite chocolate truffle cake from scratch. But she also prepared something else. She set up the projector. In her quiet, meticulous way, Margaret planned the evening's flow to match every other BBQ they'd ever hosted. Greetings, drinks, grilling, music, kids chasing bubbles. She wanted it to feel comfortable, familiar. Because when betrayal is revealed in comfort, the contrast cuts deeper. By Saturday evening, the backyard glowed under golden light. The grill hissed and popped as Thomas flipped burgers, apron tied tightly around his waist. Margaret moved gracefully between the kitchen and patio, placing dishes, pouring iced tea, laughing with guests. Kayla beamed under the pergola lights, her promotion the cause for celebration. Ryan clutched her hand proudly. Everything looked picture-perfect again. Then, like clockwork, Denise arrived. She wore a sleeveless floral top and gold sandals, her auburn hair done in soft curls. She greeted everyone with cheek kisses and loud compliments. When she hugged Thomas, Margaret didn't miss the way her hand lingered just a second too long on his shoulder. Thomas played the role effortlessly, smiling, laughing, making rounds with a beer in hand. From the outside, nothing looked off. But Margaret knew. Her heart beat slowly, steadily. She was ready. After dinner and before dessert, Margaret stepped onto the small wooden deck and clinked a glass with a fork. The chatter quieted. Dozens of eyes turned to her. She smiled warmly. "Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. It means a lot to us to be able to celebrate Kayla's promotion with all the people she loves most. You're hardworking, kind, and we're so proud of you, honey." Kayla blushed and hugged Ryan tightly. Margaret continued. "Before dessert, I thought we'd put on a little slideshow of some recent family memories, just for fun." She turned and nodded toward Nancy, who had agreed to help cue the presentation from the laptop hooked up to the backyard projector. The first few slides began to play. Photos of Kayla at her workplace, funny moments from previous BBQs, family vacations, and smiling group shots. People laughed, pointed at themselves, shared comments. Then it changed. The screen faded black for a moment. Then came the footage. Thomas and Denise, sitting together on the patio, holding hands. Denise's voice, clear and unmistakable. "You're still planning to tell her, right?" Thomas, "Of course. Just not yet. Timing's everything." Gasps erupted. A woman dropped her wine glass. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The silence that followed was heavy and breathless. Denise stood frozen, her face drained of color, her mouth trembling but silent. Thomas looked like he'd swallowed a brick. He stepped forward, hand raised as if he could stop the screen from playing, but it was too late. Everyone had seen. Kayla covered her mouth in shock. Ryan stood up so abruptly his chair clattered behind him. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, eyes flicking between his father and his wife's aunt. Margaret stood calmly at the front, still holding her glass. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Thomas's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Words struggled at the edge of his lips, but none came. He looked like a man drowning in plain air. "Margaret," he finally choked out, his voice gravelly, panicked. "You misunderstood. That video, it's out of context." But the crowd had already seen the context. The hand on the knee, the whispered promises, the timing, the look in his eyes. That wasn't a conversation between old friends. That was a secret carved out in the middle of someone else's life. Kayla turned toward Denise, her hands shaking. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Denise's eyes filled with tears, but not the kind Margaret recognized as regret. They were tears of exposure, not shame. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she stammered, voice trembling. It just did. We were talking, and one thing led to another." "You've been sneaking around with my father-in-law?" Kayla's voice cracked. "You're my aunt." Ryan stood silently behind his wife, fists clenched, breathing hard. He looked at Thomas like he didn't know him anymore. Margaret slowly walked over to the table by the grill. She reached beneath a folded napkin and pulled out a neat stack of paper. Credit card statements, highlighted, annotated, dated. She placed them on the table between herself and Thomas. "Fucking, these are the nights you told me you were at the gym, helping neighbors, or fixing gutters," she said quietly, her voice calm. "Spa packages, hotel drinks, dinners for two." The room, no, the yard, was so still you could hear the cicadas hum from the trees. "I wasn't going to confront you," she continued, looking straight into Thomas's now red face, "because I knew you'd lie. You've always been good at making lies sound reasonable. But this time, I thought maybe you'd be brave enough to tell the truth." Thomas reached out toward her, pleading, "Margaret, please. Let's talk about this. In private. Not like this." "In private?" Margaret repeated softly. "That's how this started. In shadows, behind backs, at my table, in my home. You wanted privacy so you could preserve the lie." Nancy appeared at Margaret's side, gently placing a hand on her friend's shoulder. The small gesture made Margaret's composure even more powerful. She wasn't alone, and she hadn't broken. She had prepared for this. Across the yard, guests murmured awkward excuses, some leaving with lingering glances. Embarrassment clung to the scene like smoke from the extinguished grill. Denise picked up her purse quickly, her heels crunching over gravel as she rushed out the gate, never looking back. Thomas stood there, shell-shocked, lips still moving slightly as if trying to summon words. None came. Ryan finally broke the silence. "I don't care what happens between you two, but don't come near my family for a while. I can't look at either of you." Kayla looked torn between fury and disbelief. Her eyes stayed on her mother-in-law, searching for the strength that somehow still radiated from Margaret's still frame. The projector screen hung in the background, still frozen on a frame of Thomas's hand brushing Denise's. Thomas tried once more to approach, but Margaret stepped back, not in fear, but in refusal. She looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I spent 4 decades building a life with you, Thomas. I won't spend another minute patching holes you drilled into it yourself." Then she turned away and began collecting empty cups and plates. It was the kind of moment that burned itself into memory, not because of shouting or drama, but because of the quiet, measured way a woman took back her dignity. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply exposed what needed to be exposed and let the truth do the rest. And Thomas, once the life of every party, stood forgotten under the same string lights he had once helped hang. The backyard that had echoed with laughter hours earlier now sat silent, still heavy with the scent of charcoal and scorched betrayal. Thomas remained standing by the table long after the last guest had slipped away, hands hanging limp at his sides. His apron was stained with grease and sweat, but his face held something far worse: raw humiliation. Margaret didn't say another word to him. Instead, she moved methodically through the yard, picking up paper plates, covering leftover dishes, and gently extinguishing the citronella candles. Her actions were deliberate, almost meditative, like she was cleansing not just the space but her spirit. Thomas followed her to the kitchen, trailing like a shadow that didn't belong. "Margaret," he murmured again, reaching for her wrist. She pulled away, not angrily, but with a finality that cut deeper than yelling ever could. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight," he said quietly. "You won't," she replied, not raising her voice. "You'll leave tonight." He stared at her, stunned. She didn't blink. "There's a Holiday Inn 2 exits down. You can be there in 15 minutes. Take your car and go." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but the strength in her stance made him lower his head. Slowly, he walked to the hallway, grabbed his keys, and left without slamming the door. Margaret exhaled and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the wine glass she'd abandoned hours ago. She didn't touch it. Instead, she poured the remaining wine into the sink and rinsed the glass clean. The next day was just as quiet. The sun rose, the birds chirped, and life outside her home moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside, Margaret stood in front of her wedding photo, the one from 1980, where Thomas had eyes only for her, where she looked back at him in absolute trust. She quietly removed it from the wall and placed it face down inside a drawer. At noon, Ryan showed up. His face was strained with emotion. He stepped inside and gave his mother a long, wordless hug. Kayla followed behind, red-eyed but composed. "I'm sorry," Ryan whispered. "I should have seen it. I feel disgusted." "You don't have to be sorry, sweetheart," Margaret said, stroking his back. "None of this was your burden to carry. But now that it's out, we heal. No more secrets." Kayla looked at her with watery eyes. "I'm so ashamed. My aunt, how could she?" "You're not responsible for her," Margaret said firmly. "She made her own choices, just like he did." They sat at the dining table, sipping coffee in silence. The same table that had hosted birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, and Sunday night laughs was now a quiet ground zero. But Margaret didn't flinch. She just held her cup with both hands and nodded gently. After they left, Margaret made a call. The attorney's office answered on the third ring. "Yes, I'd like to schedule a consultation," she said clearly, "to discuss the division of assets." It wasn't about divorce yet, not officially, but Margaret had no intention of being caught off guard again. Trust was gone, and dignity needed protecting. By evening, Nancy arrived with a bouquet of hydrangeas from her garden and a bottle of lemon balm tea. I brought the calming kind, she said, placing it on the table. Margaret smiled. You know me well. They sat together on the porch swing, watching the soft gold light of evening stretch across the lawn. Birds chirped. A few fireflies blinked in the distance. I thought I'd feel more broken, Margaret admitted. And do you? Nancy asked. No, Margaret whispered. I feel released. There was no fanfare in her statement, no triumphant crescendo, just peace. It had taken betrayal to show her what she'd been carrying all these years, the weight of compromise, of smoothing over small slights, of tolerating distance masquerading as routine. And now, with the truth laid bare, she finally understood her worth. Not as a wife, but as a woman who chose herself,